I need you to stay with me through this one because the headlines you are seeing do not tell the whole story. If you click away now, you will miss the part that actually matters. Over the last few weeks, something unusual has been happening behind the scenes in Minnesota. Once you see the pattern, it becomes hard to unsee. People are asking a simple question that suddenly does not have a simple answer. How does a sitting member of Congress, Ilhan Omar, go from modest financial reports to headlines about rapidly increasing wealth at the same time a major state-level fraud investigation becomes public? I want to be very clear right from the start. Allegations are not convictions. Questions are not conclusions. But when money moves fast and transparency moves slow, ordinary people are right to pause and pay attention. Here is why this matters to you. If you have spent your life paying into Social Security, Medicare, and local taxes, if you have watched every dollar carefully because you had to, then you already understand why financial accountability is not political. It is personal. Right now, taxpayers are being told to trust that everything is fine, even as investigators uncover childcare centers that may not exist, loans that were forgiven without clear oversight, and public funds that seem to have disappeared without explanation. What stopped me cold was not just the scale of the alleged fraud being reported, it was the timing. As scrutiny grows around state leadership and oversight failures, attention is also turning toward elected officials connected to the same political environment, family business ties, and sudden changes in reported assets, with online records quietly disappearing. Again, none of that proves wrongdoing by itself, but people who have lived through many situations understand this truth. When smoke keeps drifting from the same building, you do not ignore it just because no alarm has gone off yet. So let me ask you something, and I want you to think about it carefully. If this were a private company handling your retirement savings, would you accept vague explanations and delayed answers, or would you demand clarity? Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or somewhere else. And if you believe taxpayers deserve straight answers no matter who is in power, tap like and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Because once we walk through how this situation unfolded, who raised warnings early, and why certain questions are suddenly being pushed aside, you will understand why this story is not going away and why ordinary citizens are right to be paying attention right now. Before we go any further, I want to be very clear about something, because clarity is how we protect the truth. What we are talking about right now is scrutiny, questions, and ongoing reporting, not conclusions. People with life experience understand this distinction better than anyone. You have lived through moments when rumors ran ahead of facts, and you have also lived through moments when quiet questions turned out to matter a lot. So here is what is actually on the table. Investigative reporting in Minnesota has uncovered a large multi-year fraud case involving state and federal childcare and welfare funds. According to court filings and reporting, dozens of childcare centers were approved for millions in public dollars while allegedly operating improperly. Some were reportedly inactive, unsafe, or barely functioning. Federal prosecutors have already brought charges in several cases connected to this broader investigation. That part is documented. That part is real. Now, here is where politics enters the picture. As this situation widened, lawmakers and journalists began asking how such a large operation could run for years without being stopped. Those questions have been aimed at state leadership, oversight agencies, and the systems meant to protect taxpayer dollars. That is when the spotlight started shifting from institutions to individuals. And that is where Ilhan Omar enters the conversation, not as someone charged with a crime, but as a public figure now facing intense political and media scrutiny because of family financial disclosures, sudden changes in reported wealth, and connections being debated publicly. Let me say this slowly because people value fairness. No court has ruled that Congresswoman Omar committed fraud. No indictment has been announced against her. What has happened is this: reporters, political opponents, and watchdogs are raising questions about how wealth changed, what the disclosures show, and whether additional transparency is needed. And that is a critical difference. I remember sitting with an elder who told me, questions do not mean guilt, but silence does not mean innocence either. That stuck with me because accountability in a democracy does not start with verdicts. It starts with daylight. Here is why this matters to you watching at home. When public money is involved, your tax dollar scrutiny is not harassment. It is responsibility. And when those questions touch powerful people, they do not go away quietly. What we need to understand next is why this particular moment caused scrutiny to intensify. Why wealth disclosure suddenly became a focal point, and why some data appeared to change right as attention increased. That timing is what pulled a lot of people deeper into this story, and it is what we need to examine next. Now, let me be very clear about something before we go any further, because people value fairness as much as they value truth. No one gets convicted on a headline. No one gets judged on a rumor. What we are talking about here is scrutiny, the kind that follows money when public funds and public trust are involved. As investigators in Minnesota began pulling threads on how these childcare and welfare programs were administered, the spotlight did not stay on the programs alone. It moved naturally toward the political leadership connected to the system. That includes the governor's office, state agencies, and eventually elected officials whose families or close associates appeared in public records tied to the environment under review. That is where the name Ilhan Omar enters the conversation, not as a verdict, but as a question that reporters, lawmakers, and constituents are now asking out loud. Public financial disclosures show that her household finances have changed significantly over a relatively short period of time. Now, I want to pause here because wealth changes alone are not illegal. People sell property, people invest, people write books, people with life experience know that. But when those changes happen alongside a widening investigation into misuse of taxpayer funds, questions are not only fair, they are necessary. What added fuel to the scrutiny was reporting that certain online business records connected to Omar's family appeared to change or disappear after public attention increased. Again, that does not prove wrongdoing, but in accountability work, timing matters. People understand that instinctively. When records change after questions start, it invites deeper review, not dismissal. I have sat through enough oversight hearings to tell you this. Investigators do not follow politics. They follow paper trails, bank records, grant filings, PPP loan forgiveness lists, corporate registrations. Those documents do not care about party labels or speeches. They either line up or they do not. And that is why some lawmakers are now calling for independent audits and federal review, not to accuse, but to verify, to ensure that every dollar intended for children, families, and communities actually went where it was supposed to go. Here is the uncomfortable truth people already know. When oversight fails at one level, it rarely stops there. It spreads upward and outward, touching people who may never have expected to be questioned. And as this scrutiny grows, the real issue becomes bigger than one name. It becomes about whether the system protected taxpayers or protected itself. That is the tension building right now. And it is why what comes next has lawmakers on both sides bracing for answers they may not control. This is the moment where I need to slow us down. When a story starts mixing numbers, family ties, and government money, the truth can get blurry fast. And people deserve clarity, not accusations dressed up as certainty. Here's what we actually know. Public financial disclosures for members of Congress are required by law. They are broad ranges, not exact figures. When those ranges change sharply over a short period of time, it triggers attention, not guilt. Attention. And in Minnesota right now, attention is exactly what is happening. Questions are being raised about how certain families connected to political leadership saw rapid financial growth during the same years that massive fraud investigations were unfolding in state-funded programs. That overlap is what is fueling scrutiny, not proof of wrongdoing, but proximity and timing matters. Investigative journalists and lawmakers have pointed out that some business entities, nonprofit connections, and financial records appeared to change or go quiet right as public interest increased. That does not automatically mean something illegal happened. Sometimes it means legal counsel gets involved. Sometimes it means privacy concerns. Sometimes it means absolutely nothing at all. But in public service, perception still matters. I have said this before, and I will say it again. When you represent people who are struggling to afford groceries, rent, and medication, even the appearance of unexplained wealth raises legitimate questions. People understand this instinctively. You know the difference between earning, inheriting, investing, and benefiting from a system that was not watching closely enough. What is important is this. No court has ruled that Ilhan Omar committed a crime related to these matters. No charge has been filed. No conviction exists. Anyone telling you otherwise is lying to you. But here is the other truth. Calls for audits, ethics reviews, and formal investigations are not attacks. They are accountability tools. And in a democracy, accountability applies to everyone, regardless of party, background, or popularity. I have watched too many situations where leaders tried to shut down questions instead of answering them. That never ends well. Transparency calms things down. Silence fuels speculation. What is making this moment different is that it is not just about one person. It is about whether a system meant to protect children and families was exploited and whether anyone with power noticed or chose not to. That is where this story is headed next. Because once systems fail at this scale, responsibility does not stop at the ground level. It always travels upward. This is where the story starts to feel heavier, not louder, but heavier. Because once investigators and reporters began pulling on the threads of this Minnesota situation, the conversation did not stay limited to agencies or departments. It moved toward people. And when that happens, people know the rules change. You slow down, you choose your words carefully, and you follow the money. I am not the rumors. Here is what has been reported. As questions grew about oversight failures and alleged misuse of childcare and welfare funds, attention widened to public figures connected to the system, not accusations, scrutiny. And there is a difference. Scrutiny means asking how wealth changes happened, when they happened, and whether they align with public disclosures and ethics requirements. In Ilhan Omar's case, reporters and critics began pointing to publicly available financial disclosures and online business records tied to her family and household. Some outlets and commentators claimed those records showed a rapid increase in assets over a relatively short period of time. Others noted changes to websites and business listings that raised eyebrows, not because they proved wrongdoing, but because they fueled questions. And people understand this instinctively. When something looks sudden, when records shift, when explanations lag behind headlines, people start asking why. Not because they want a scandal, but because transparency matters. I want to be very clear here. Wealth increasing is not a crime. Family members having businesses is not a crime. Changes in online records are not proof of wrongdoing, but in public service, perception and disclosure matter. When taxpayer money is involved anywhere near the system, questions are inevitable. I think about elders who taught me that accountability is not about accusations, but about answers. If everything is clean, then clarity protects everyone. And if there are gaps, they need to be addressed openly, not pushed aside as politics. What unsettled a lot of people was not a single number or a single document. It was the combination, timing, silence, and a broader environment where oversight had already failed in other areas. People know how patterns work. One loose thread does not mean much. Several woven together demand attention. And that is why this moment did not fade. It escalated. Calls for independent reviews, demands for explanations, and a growing sense that this story was not just about one person, but about whether systems meant to protect the vulnerable were being watched closely enough. And once that realization sets in, the pressure only grows. Here is where this stops being about one program, one audit, or one state, and starts becoming a question of leadership and responsibility. Because people know this better than anyone. When problems repeat for years, it is no longer a mistake. It is a system that is not working. As this story widened, attention did not stay on the child care centers alone. It moved upward to the agencies responsible for oversight, to the officials who received warnings, and to the political leaders who had the authority to act. That is when Governor Tim Walz entered the conversation, not because he has been charged with anything, but because multiple reports say his administration was alerted early and often. Whistleblowers have described raising red flags and feeling ignored. Auditors have pointed to gaps that lingered year after year, and people watching this understand the instinctive reaction. If the same problems keep resurfacing, someone at the top has to explain why. Now, this is important. Accountability is not the same as accusation. Nobody is saying oversight failures automatically equal intent, but leadership means answering hard questions, especially when taxpayer money is involved. And people who paid into these systems their entire lives have every right to ask how safeguards failed for so long. As the pressure grew, the spotlight did not stop there. It widened again, this time toward federal lawmakers connected to the region, including Ilhan Omar. And let me be very clear with you, what is happening here is scrutiny, not a verdict. Reports and commentators began asking questions about financial disclosures, public records, and a sudden rise in reported household wealth tied to business ventures and consulting work. Some online sources claimed data was altered or removed. Others called for independent review, and people know the difference. Asking for transparency is not the same as declaring wrongdoing. I have sat across from constituents who told me, if everything is clean, then show us. That is not hostility. That is trust building. And when public figures face questions, the strongest response is clarity and not silence. This moment matters because it tests whether our systems respond to questions with openness or defensiveness, and that response will shape what happens next. Because once scrutiny reaches this level, once calls for review grow louder, the story does not fade. It either gets resolved with facts or it expands. And what happens next is why this conversation is not going away. You know, this is where the story stops being about paperwork and starts being about accountability. And I want to be very careful here because people understand the difference between scrutiny and guilt. What we are talking about now are questions, not conclusions. And in a healthy democracy, questions are not attacks. They are safeguards. As this Minnesota situation widened, attention did not just stay on agencies or systems. It moved upward toward leadership, toward oversight, toward the people voters trusted to make sure guardrails actually worked. That is when names started coming up in public conversations, including Ilhan Omar, not because anyone had proven wrongdoing, but because of proximity, influence, and timing. Here's what raised eyebrows for a lot of people. At the same time, investigators and journalists were uncovering massive failures in childcare and welfare oversight. Reports began circulating about a sudden and significant change in Omar's family finances. Not gradual, not over decades, but compressed into a short window. For people who have lived through audits, background checks, and financial disclosures, you know why that timing alone invites scrutiny. And scrutiny does not mean guilt. It means pause. I want to slow this down. Members of Congress file financial disclosures every year. Those disclosures are public. They are meant to build trust, but they are also limited ranges, not exact figures, categories instead of line items. When a public figure's reported net worth changes quickly, journalists do what they are supposed to do. They ask how, when, and why. That is what is happening here. Some reporting pointed to business interests, consulting arrangements, and online records that appeared to change or disappear around the same time. Questions intensified. Now, that does not prove anything. Websites get updated, businesses rebrand, data changes, but people know that when multiple signals line up at once, it is reasonable to ask for clarity. What matters is how leaders respond to questions, not whether questions exist. And this is where trust either gets repaired or erodes, because when people feel stonewalled, when answers are vague, or when critics are dismissed instead of addressed, suspicion grows even if nothing improper occurred. Transparency is the antidote. Silence is gasoline. I have seen this pattern in my own life. Not in politics, but in organizations where leadership refuses to explain decisions. Even innocent choices can look wrong when no one is willing to walk people through them. So the real issue here is not a verdict, it is confidence, public confidence. And once that confidence starts to wobble, the pressure does not go away, it intensifies. Which brings us to the political reaction that followed and why this story did not stop at Minnesota's border. This is the moment where the story stops being about personalities and starts being about systems. And people understand why that matters. When questions like these surface, the responsible move is not to point fingers. It is to ask who is supposed to be watching the store. What we know from reporting, public records, and statements is that lawmakers on both sides are now asking for more transparency. Not convictions, not verdicts, transparency. They are asking for audits, timelines, and explanations about how oversight worked, where it failed, and whether the safeguards taxpayers were promised actually existed on paper and in practice. And I want to be very clear here. Asking for an investigation is not an accusation. It is a process. People know the difference because you have lived through enough moments where rumors ran ahead of facts and enough moments where facts only came out because someone insisted on looking closer. I think back to conversations I have had with people who worked their entire lives, paid their taxes faithfully, and expected the rules to apply evenly. They were not angry, they were tired of hearing that accountability would come later, tired of watching oversight fail quietly while regular people were told to tighten their belts. That is why this phase of the story matters so much. When reports say records were changed or data became harder to find or explanations shifted over time, those are signals that demand clarity, not outrage. Clarity. People understand that when stories change, documentation becomes more important, not less. And here's the tension that is building. If investigations confirm everything was above board, transparency clears the air. But if oversight gaps are confirmed, then this is not about one person at all. It is about a system that did not do its job while public money moved through it. That is the question hanging in the air right now. Not who is guilty, but who was watching and when. I have learned in my own life that sunlight does two things. It protects the innocent and it reveals where accountability broke down. Either way, it is necessary. And as this story moves forward, people will recognize something familiar. The truth rarely arrives all at once. It comes piece by piece, document by document, question by question. Which brings us to the hardest part of this conversation. What this moment says about trust, leadership, and the standards we expect when public money is involved. I want to pause here and speak to you plainly because people know the difference between accountability and accusation. What we have been talking about tonight is not a verdict. It is a pattern that has raised serious questions, questions that deserve answers, not shouting matches. When stories surface about public money, oversight failures, and sudden changes in wealth tied to people in power, the responsible move is to slow down and verify. That is especially true when a name as prominent as Ilhan Omar enters the conversation. Scrutiny is not a sentence, it is a process, and process matters. You have lived long enough to remember moments when rumors raced ahead of facts, and you have also seen times when quiet, methodical reporting revealed problems that loud denial could not erase. That is why this moment calls for patience and clarity. If wealth disclosures changed rapidly, the records should explain why. If oversight failed, the paper trail should show where. And if nothing improper occurred, transparency will clear the air. I think about elders who taught me to read past the headline. They would say, follow the money, but follow the rules too. That wisdom applies here. We can demand explanations without assuming guilt. We can insist on audits, disclosures, and independent reviews without turning concern into condemnation. For people, this is not abstract. You pay taxes. You rely on programs that work only when oversight works. You have watched what happens when trust erodes. It is always the people on fixed incomes who feel it first. So asking for accountability is not partisan. It is practical. And here is the part I do not want you to miss. The loudest voices often try to rush you into taking a side before the facts are finished. Do not let them. The strongest position is the one that waits for documentation, sworn statements, and verified reporting. Because when answers come, and they will, the people who stayed grounded will be the ones standing on solid ground. And that brings us to how we close this responsibly and what you can do next to make sure truth, not noise, wins. I want to slow this down before we end, because moments like this deserve clarity, not chaos. What we walked through tonight is not a verdict. It is a question. And people know the difference better than anyone. You have lived long enough to see how quickly suspicion can turn into certainty online and how dangerous that can be when facts are still being examined. Here is the truth that matters most. When public officials face scrutiny over finances, oversight is not an attack. It is accountability. And accountability is not partisan. It is the price of public trust. That is as true for Democrats as it is for Republicans. It is true whether you like the politician or not. And it is especially true when taxpayer money is involved. I have said this before, and I will say it again. Transparency protects everyone. If there is nothing to hide, sunlight clears the air. If there are unanswered questions, they deserve answers through proper investigations, not viral accusations. People understand process. You have trusted systems your whole lives, courts, audits, inspectors, because rumor is not justice and silence is not proof. What concerns me is not just one name or one state. It is the pattern. When oversight fails, when whistleblowers say they were ignored, when massive sums move with little explanation, trust erodes. And once trust erodes, communities fracture. We have all paid that price before. So here is what I am asking of you. Stay engaged, but stay grounded. Ask hard questions, but demand real evidence. Do not let anyone rush you into conclusions. Not social media, not politicians, not commentators. Your experience gives you a filter. Younger generations are still learning to build. I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you believe stronger oversight is needed when public money is involved? Should financial disclosures be clearer for elected officials? These conversations matter, especially when they are led with wisdom instead of outrage. If this breakdown helped you see the bigger picture, tap like, share it with someone who values facts over frenzy, and make sure you are subscribed because we do not stop asking questions just because a headline moves on. And before you go, look to the left side of your screen. The video waiting there pulls back another layer on how scrutiny turns into accountability and how people can spot the difference between investigation and manipulation. Click it. I will meet you over there and we will keep following the truth carefully.